The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Westlake Conservatory's main building, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The hallways buzzed with activity as students rushed to their classes, instrument cases bumping against their legs, sheet music clutched in their hands. Among them walked Lin Wei, her steps measured and quiet compared to the confident strides of those around her. Lin had transferred to Westlake just 2 weeks ago, and still felt like a stranger in these grand hallways. Back home in Shanghai, she had been somebody. Here, she was just another face in the crowd, and that was exactly what she wanted. She checked her schedule again, though she had memorized it days ago. Advanced Piano Theory with Professor Richardson, room 307. Her stomach tightened at the thought. She had heard plenty about Professor Richardson already. His brilliance, his demanding standards, and his particular enjoyment of putting new students on the spot. Lin slipped into the classroom just as the final bell rang. Most seats in the front were already taken, so she made her way to an empty chair in the back row. Perfect. The less visible she was, the better. The room fell silent as Professor Richardson entered. He was tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the look of a stern eagle. He carried no books or notes, just a single folder tucked under his arm. "Good morning," he said, his voice filling the room effortlessly. "Today we continue our exploration of Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, arguably one of the most technically challenging pieces in the classical repertoire." Lin felt a small flutter in her chest at the mention of the piece. The familiar notes played in her mind automatically, her fingers twitching slightly in her lap as they traced phantom keys. Professor Richardson began writing on the board, outlining the complex structure of the concerto's first movement. "What makes this piece particularly difficult," he continued, "is not just its technical demands, but the emotional depth required to perform it properly. Rachmaninoff didn't write this piece to be merely played. He wrote it to be felt." A student in the front row, a boy with perfectly combed hair and an expensive-looking watch, raised his hand. "Professor, I've been practicing the opening sequence for months and I still can't get the timing right. How did Rachmaninoff himself manage it?" Professor Richardson smiled slightly. "An excellent question, Thomas. Rachmaninoff had unusually large hands, which certainly helped with the extended reaches. But more importantly, he understood the architecture of what he had created. He wasn't just hitting notes. He was telling a story. This sparked a lively discussion. Students began sharing their experiences with the piece, the challenges they'd encountered, the breakthroughs they'd made. Lin remained silent, her eyes focused on her notebook where she'd begun sketching the outline of a piano keyboard. 15 minutes into the class, Professor Richardson paused, his eyes scanning the room slowly. Lin felt his gaze stop on her and she sank lower in her seat. "I don't believe I've heard from our new student yet," he said, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. "Ms. Wei, isn't it?" Lin nodded, feeling 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her. "You've been very quiet," he continued. "Tell me, are you familiar with Rachmaninoff's Third?" "Yes," she said softly. "I've heard it." Professor Richardson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Heard it, you say? Just heard it? Have you ever attempted to play it?" Several students chuckled, and Lin felt her cheeks grow warm. They all assumed she was like many casual piano students who admired the great concertos without understanding their complexity. "I've tried," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Interesting." Professor Richardson set down his chalk and dusted off his hands. "Well, perhaps you could give us a demonstration." The room went completely still. Lin froze, her heart suddenly pounding in her ears. I don't... "The piano is right there," he said, gesturing to the gleaming black grand piano at the front of the room. "Just the opening theme would be sufficient. I'd like to assess your current level." Lin looked at the piano as if it were a dangerous animal. This was exactly what she had been trying to avoid. Attention, expectations, the weight of her past. "Professor," a girl with braided hair spoke up, "that's not really fair. Nobody can just sit down and play that piece without preparation." "That's precisely my point, Zoe," Professor Richardson replied. "It requires years of disciplined study. But even attempting it can be instructive." He turned back to Lin. "Well, we're waiting, Ms. Wei." The other students were watching her with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Thomas, the boy who had asked the first question, wore a slightly smug expression that suggested he was enjoying her discomfort. Slowly, Lin gathered her notebook and pencil. Her legs felt wooden as she made her way to the front of the classroom. Each step echoed in the silent room. The piano bench felt cool beneath her as she sat down. She adjusted it slightly, a habit formed from thousands of hours of practice. Her hands hovered over the keys and she took a deep breath. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had come to Westlake to escape, to be normal, to hide among ordinary students. But now here she was, exactly where she had always been, in front of a piano with people waiting, judging, expecting. Professor Richardson stood nearby, arms crossed, watching her with clinical interest. "Whenever you're ready," he said, his tone suggesting he didn't expect much. Lynn closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm her racing heart. The truth was, she knew this piece intimately. Too intimately. The opening theme of Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto had been part of her life for years. The soaring melody, the rhythmic complexity, the emotional weight of it. She thought about playing it poorly on purpose, just fumbling through it enough to satisfy the professor's request without revealing too much. But as her fingers touched the cool ivory keys, something inside her rebelled against the idea. The piano had always been her truth-teller. Even now, when she wanted to hide, she found she couldn't lie through her music. Lynn took another deep breath and began to play. The famous opening melody emerged from beneath her fingers, deceptively simple at first, a quiet theme that felt almost like a question asked in hushed tones. Around her, she sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere. The initial notes were manageable for many advanced students, but even in these opening measures, Lynn couldn't help but shape the phrases with the understanding of where they would lead. As the theme developed, growing more complex, her hands moved with increasing confidence. Her right hand carried the melody while her left handled the rolling accompaniment that made this piece so challenging. The notes flowed from memory, from muscle memory, from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. She had forgotten the classroom, forgotten Professor Richardson standing just feet away. The music carried her back to countless hours in practice rooms, to competition stages, to moments of frustration and triumph. Her body remembered the piece even as her mind had tried to forget it. The opening section built to its first small climax, and Lynn's fingers danced across the keys with precision and fluidity. This was where most students began to struggle, where the technical demands increased exponentially. But her hands moved without hesitation, finding each note, each chord, each subtle shift in tempo. A small gasp from somewhere in the classroom briefly pulled her back to awareness of her surroundings. She glanced up to see Professor Richardson's expression had completely transformed. Gone was the skeptical, slightly condescending look. His eyes were wide, his arms no longer crossed but hanging loosely at his sides. Lynn quickly looked back down at the keyboard, but it was too late. The spell of anonymity was broken. They were seeing her now, really seeing her, and there was no way to become invisible again. Still, she continued playing. The music had always been her refuge, and even now, exposed as she was, she found comfort in the familiar patterns beneath her fingers. She approached the section where the full orchestra would normally enter in a concert performance, the point where the soloist's role becomes even more demanding. Without the orchestra behind her, Lynn had to suggest both parts, the thundering response of the full ensemble and the piano's intricate voice weaving through it. Her hands stretched to reach difficult intervals, her fingers moving with the speed and accuracy that only came from years of dedicated practice. The classroom had disappeared entirely now. Lynn was lost in the music and the story it told. Rachmaninoff had written this concerto as a conversation between piano and orchestra, between individual and world, between heart and mind. Even playing just a portion of it on a classroom piano, Lynn couldn't help but convey that dialogue. As she approached the end of the exposition section, her playing reached a brief moment of resolution before the development would typically begin. Rather than continuing into the next major section of the concerto, Lynn gently brought the passage to a close, her fingers finally coming to rest on the keys. For several seconds, absolute silence filled the room. Lynn remained still, her eyes on the keyboard, afraid to look up and see the expressions on the faces around her. The quiet hummed in her ears, seeming to stretch into eternity. Then someone in the back of the room began to clap. Another student joined in, and another, until the entire classroom erupted in applause. Lynn finally raised her head to see her classmates staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to admiration, to outright disbelief. Professor Richardson hadn't moved. He stood exactly where he had been, but the change in his demeanor was striking. Gone was the stern taskmaster who had ordered her to the piano minutes ago. In his place stood a musician who had just witnessed something unexpected and remarkable. "Ms. Wei," he said finally, his voice much quieter than before. "I think you and I need to have a conversation about your musical background." Lynn nodded slightly, her hands now folded tightly in her lap. This was exactly what she had been trying to avoid, but there was no escaping it now. The music had given her away, had told her secret to everyone in the room. She was not just another student. She never had been. And now everyone at Westlake Conservatory was about to discover exactly who Lin Wei really was, and what she had been running from. The applause faded into stunned whispers as Lynn sat motionless at the piano. She could feel the weight of 20 stares pressing against her back. The air in the classroom suddenly thick with questions. Professor Richardson cleared his throat, bringing silence back to the room. "Class," he said, his voice noticeably gentler than before, "please review pages 42 through 55 in your textbooks while I speak with Ms. Wei." The rustle of pages filled the room as students reluctantly turned their attention to their books, though many continued to steal glances at Lynn. Professor Richardson gestured toward the door, and Lynn rose from the piano bench, her legs feeling oddly disconnected from her body. They stepped into the empty hallway, the heavy classroom door closing behind them with a soft click. The morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long rectangles of light on the polished floor. For a moment, neither spoke. "That was—" Professor Richardson began, then paused, seeming to search for the right words. "That was extraordinary, Ms. Wei." Lynn looked down at her shoes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Where did you study before coming here?" he asked. Lynn hesitated. This was exactly the conversation she had been dreading since arriving at Westlake. "I studied in Shanghai," she said finally. "With Professor Mei Ling." Professor Richardson's eyebrows shot up. "Mei Ling? The Mei Ling who taught at the Shanghai Conservatory?" Lynn nodded. "She's legendary," he said, a note of awe creeping into his voice. "She's trained some of the finest pianists in Asia." "And you studied directly with her?" "Yes, for 8 years." Professor Richardson leaned against the wall, studying her with new interest. "And yet you transferred here to a school thousands of miles away, and said nothing about your background." It wasn't a question, but Lynn could hear the confusion in his voice. The sunlight shifted as clouds passed outside, and Lynn watched the patterns change on the floor. How could she explain? How could she tell him about the crushing pressure, the endless competitions, the way music had transformed from joy to burden? How could she describe the panic attacks before performances, the weight of everyone's expectations, the moment when she knew she needed to escape? "I needed a fresh start," she said simply. Professor Richardson nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he knew there was more to the story. "Well, you certainly surprised me in there, and that doesn't happen often." A small smile crossed his face. "You played beautifully, not just technically precise, but with genuine feeling. That's rare, especially for Rachmaninoff." "Thank you," Lynn said again, still not meeting his eyes. "May I ask, have you performed the entire concerto?" Lynn nodded. 3 times. Once with the Shanghai Youth Orchestra and twice in competition. Professor Richardson let out a low whistle. "That's remarkable for someone your age. Most pianists don't attempt the full concerto until well into their 20s. If ever." A memory flashed through Lynn's mind, standing backstage at her first performance. Just 16 years old, her hands shaking so badly she had to sit on them until it was time to walk out. Professor May's voice in her ear. "Remember, Lynn, the audience doesn't just want to hear the notes. They want to feel what Rachmaninoff felt." "Ms. Wei." Professor Richardson's voice pulled her back to the present. "I hope you'll forgive my behavior in class. Had I known your level of skill, I never would have put you on the spot like that." Lynn finally looked up at him. His apology seemed genuine, his earlier arrogance replaced by professional respect. "It's okay," she said. "I understand. You were testing me. Still, it was unfair, and I apologize." He straightened up from the wall. "Now I have a proposition for you." Lynn felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Here it comes, she thought. The special treatment, the extra expectations, the path back to where she had been trying to escape. "Westlake hosts an annual winter showcase," he continued. "It's our most prestigious performance event. featuring our most talented students. I'd like you to consider performing." Lynn's heart sank. "Professor, I appreciate the offer, but you don't have to decide right now," he said quickly. "The showcase isn't until December. You have time to think about it." He glanced back at the classroom door. "We should return to class. But please consider what I've said." Lynn nodded, though inside she was already forming her refusal. She had come to Westlake to be normal, to study music without the pressure of performance. The last thing she wanted was to be singled out, to become the center of attention again. They re-entered the classroom, and all eyes immediately turned to them. Professor Richardson resumed his lecture as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but Lynn could feel the shift in how her classmates looked at her as she returned to her seat. The anonymity she had carefully cultivated over the past 2 weeks had evaporated in a matter of minutes. When the bell rang at the end of class, Lynn gathered her things quickly, hoping to slip out before anyone could approach her, but she wasn't fast enough. "Hey, wait up!" Lynn turned to see a girl with curly hair and round glasses hurrying toward her. It was Zoe, the student who had spoken up in her defense earlier. "That was amazing," Zoe said, falling into step beside Lynn as they exited the classroom. "Seriously, I've never heard anyone our age play like that." "Thanks," Lynn said, keeping her eyes forward as they navigated the crowded hallway. "I'm Zoe, by the way. I don't think we've officially met, Lynn. So where did you learn to play like that? You must have had an incredible teacher." Lynn sighed inwardly. This was going to be her new reality: constant questions, constant attention. "I studied in Shanghai," she said, giving the same brief answer she had given Professor Richardson. "Cool. I've always wanted to visit China. Hey, a bunch of us practice in the East Wing studios after classes. You should join us sometime." Before Lynn could respond, another voice called out behind them. "Lynn, hold on a second." They both turned to see Thomas, the boy with the expensive watch, approaching. Up close, Lynn could see the hint of irritation behind his smile. "I just wanted to introduce myself properly," he said, extending his hand. "Thomas Chen, I'm Professor Richardson's student assistant." Lynn shook his hand briefly. "Nice to meet you. Your playing was impressive," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely pleased about it. "Are you planning to participate in the winter showcase? Professor Richardson usually asks me to perform the closing piece." Ah, Lynn thought. Now she understood his irritation. She had inadvertently threatened his position as the department star. "I haven't decided yet," she said, which was partly true. She had decided against it but hadn't told Professor Richardson. "Well, it's a big responsibility," Thomas continued. "Not everyone can handle that kind of pressure. Anyway, if you need any help finding your way around campus, just let me know." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks," Lynn said, already stepping away. "I should get to my next class." As she and Zoe continued down the hallway, Zoe leaned closer. "Don't mind Thomas. He's been the piano department's golden boy for 2 years. Your performance probably gave him his first taste of insecurity." Lynn nodded but didn't reply. This was exactly the kind of drama she had hoped to avoid. Throughout the rest of the day, Lynn noticed the changed way people looked at her. Students she had never spoken to now smiled and waved. Teachers who had barely registered her presence now called on her in class. Word traveled fast at Westlake, and by lunchtime, it seemed everyone had heard about the new transfer student who had stunned Professor Richardson's advanced piano theory class. In the cafeteria, Lynn found a quiet corner table, hoping for a few minutes of peace. She had just unwrapped her sandwich when Zoe appeared again, this time with 2 other students. "Mind if we join you?" Zoe asked, already setting down her tray. Before Lynn could answer, they had all taken seats at her table. Zoe introduced her friends: Raj, a tall boy who studied violin, and Hannah, a petite girl with a serious expression who specialized in composition. "We heard what happened in Richardson's class," Raj said, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Is it true you played the Rach 3 from memory?" Lynn took a small bite of her sandwich, buying time. These people seemed friendly enough, but she was wary of becoming a curiosity, a topic of gossip. "Just part of it," she said finally. "Still, that's incredible," Hannah said, her voice soft but intense. "I've been working on a piece that needs piano accompaniment, and I've been struggling to find someone who can handle the technical aspects. Would you consider looking at it sometime?" Lynn looked at Hannah's hopeful expression and felt her defenses weakening slightly. This wasn't about showing off her competition. This was about music, about collaboration. Maybe that kind of playing would be okay. I could look at it, she said cautiously. No promises, though. Hannah's face lit up. Really? That would be amazing. It's for my final composition project, and I've been stuck for weeks. As lunch continued, Lynn found herself drawn into their conversation despite her reservations. They talked about music, about their favorite composers, about the strange quirks of Westlake's professors. For the first time since arriving, Lynn felt something like normalcy, just students talking about shared interests. But as the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period, Lynn caught sight of Professor Richardson watching her from across the cafeteria. When their eyes met, he gave her a small nod as if to say, "I'm still waiting for your answer." Lynn gathered her things, that familiar tightness returning to her chest. She had come to Westlake seeking anonymity, a chance to rediscover her love for music without the crushing pressure of expectations. In just one morning, that plan had completely unraveled. Now she faced a choice. Continue trying to hide her abilities, knowing it was probably too late, or embrace this new path, with all the attention and expectations it would bring. As she headed to her next class, the notes of Rachmaninoff's concerto played in her mind, both a reminder of what she had been running from and what she could never truly escape, her own extraordinary talent. By Friday afternoon, 3 days after her unexpected performance in Professor Richardson's class, Lynn had settled into an uneasy new routine. She no longer blended into the background as she walked the halls of Westlake Conservatory. Students she had never spoken to greeted her by name. Professors who had previously paid her little attention now watched her with interest during lessons. Lynn sat in the back corner of the library, hiding behind a stack of music theory books. She had come to study, but found herself instead staring out the tall windows at the autumn leaves drifting down onto the campus lawn. A text message notification lit up her phone screen. Practice room 12, 5 p.m., bringing my composition. No pressure! Hannah Lynn smiled slightly. Despite her reluctance to draw attention, she had found herself genuinely curious about Hannah's music. Unlike Thomas and some of the other competitive piano students, Hannah's interest seemed purely artistic, without ulterior motives. I'll be there, Lynn texted back. She returned to her theory homework, but her focus was broken moments later when someone slid into the chair across from her. Lynn looked up to see Professor May's face staring back at her, not in person but on the screen of a tablet that Thomas was holding up. Recognize her? Thomas asked, his voice low but intense. Lynn felt her stomach drop. On the screen was a video from the Shanghai International Piano Competition 3 years ago. A younger version of herself sat at a grand piano on stage, while Professor May watched from the wings. Where did you get that? Lynn whispered. Thomas lowered the tablet. YouTube. Wasn't hard to find once I knew where to look. He set the tablet down, the video still playing silently. Lin Wei, child prodigy, winner of the Shanghai International Piano Competition at age 16. Protégé of Professor Mei Ling, featured soloist with the Beijing Philharmonic before you were even old enough to drive. Lin glanced around nervously, but the library was nearly empty, no one close enough to overhear. Why are you showing me this? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Thomas leaned forward. I'm just curious why someone with your resume would transfer to Westlake and pretend to be nobody. Were you hoping to coast through on your reputation? Or maybe you're running from something? The accusation in his tone made Lynn's chest tighten. She closed her theory book with deliberate calm. I'm not pretending anything, Thomas. I just didn't think my background was anyone's business. It becomes everyone's business when Professor Richardson starts changing his plans. For the winter showcase, Thomas's carefully maintained smile slipped for a moment. I've been working toward the featured soloist position for 2 years, so that was it. Thomas was worried about losing his spot, his status, his moment in the spotlight. I haven't accepted any position in the showcase, Lynn said truthfully. Thomas studied her face, seeming to weigh her words. Well, if you're really not interested, you should tell Richardson soon. He's already talking to the department head about featuring you. Lynn's heart sank. She had hoped that by not responding to Professor Richardson's offer, he would simply move on. Instead, it seemed he was already making arrangements. I'll talk to him, she promised. Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied. He picked up his tablet, the video of Lynn's competition performance still playing. Her younger self was taking a bow, flowers being presented on stage as the audience applauded. "You were good," Thomas said, his tone softer now. "What happened? Why did you stop competing?" Lynn looked down at her hands spread flat on the library table. The same hands that had earned her trophies, scholarships, standing ovations. The same hands that had started trembling uncontrollably before her last scheduled performance, leaving her curled up backstage, unable to breathe, unable to step out under the lights again. "Sometimes things just change," she said quietly. Thomas seemed about to press further, but instead he simply nodded and stood up. "Just talk to Richardson, okay?" After he left, Lynn remained at the table, her homework forgotten. On the day she'd enrolled at Westlake, she had imagined a different path forward. One where she could study music because she loved it, not because she was expected to perform it brilliantly. That dream had lasted exactly 2 weeks and 3 days. At 5 o'clock, Lynn made her way to practice room 12, a small studio tucked away in the east wing of the music building. She found Hannah already there, sheets of handwritten music spread across the upright piano. "You came," Hannah said, her serious face lighting up. "I wasn't sure you would." "I said I would," Lynn replied simply. Hannah gathered her papers, organizing them into a neat stack. "So this is my final project for advanced composition. It's supposed to be a piece for piano and cello, exploring the concept of conversation between instruments." She handed the sheets to Lynn. "The problem is, I can't play it well enough myself to know if what I'm hearing in my head actually works on the piano." Lynn sat down at the upright and began to look through the composition. It was complex with unexpected harmonic shifts and challenging rhythmic patterns, but there was something compelling about it too. A clear voice, a distinctive point of view. "This is really interesting," Lynn said, genuinely impressed. "The way you've structured the dialogue between piano and cello, it's like they're finishing each other's thoughts." Hannah blinked in surprise. "Yes, that's exactly what I was trying to do. Nobody else has understood that." Lynn placed the music on the stand and began to play the piano part, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, as she grasped the internal logic of Hannah's composition. The music filled the small practice room, resonating against the soundproofed walls. After playing through the first movement, Lynn stopped. "The middle section here," she pointed to a particularly dense passage. "It feels like it wants to breathe more. Have you considered opening up the spacing between these chords?" Hannah leaned over, studying the section Lynn indicated. "I was worried about losing the tension if I spread it out. Maybe try this instead." Lynn played the passage again, but with subtle adjustments, allowing small pauses between phrases, like spaces between words in a sentence. Hannah's eyes widened. "That's it." "That's exactly how I heard it in my head, but I couldn't figure out how to notate it." She grabbed a pencil from behind her ear and began making marks on the score. "Can you play it again just like that?" For the next hour, they worked through Hannah's composition, Lynn playing while Hannah made adjustments. Lynn found herself fully absorbed in the process, offering suggestions, experimenting with different interpretations. For the first time since arriving at Westlake, she wasn't thinking about her past or worrying about her cover being blown. She was simply making music. "You two sound amazing together." Lynn and Hannah both turned to see Zoe and Raj standing in the doorway of the practice room. "Sorry to interrupt," Raj said. "We were heading to dinner and heard you playing. It sounded too good to just walk by." Hannah beamed. "Lynn's helping me with my composition project. She's figured out things I've been stuck on for weeks." Zoe dropped her violin case by the door and came to look over Lynn's shoulder at the music. "This looks seriously complex, Hannah. Are you trying to win a Pulitzer before graduation?" "It's not that complex," Hannah protested. "It's just particular." "Well, it sounds beautiful," Raj said. "Hey, we were going to grab dinner at that pizza place off campus. Want to join us?" Lynn hesitated. Part of her wanted to retreat back to her dorm room, back to safety and solitude. But another part, a part that had been quiet for too long, wanted to stay in this moment, creating music, talking about it with people who understood. "I should finish helping Hannah first," she said. "I can wait," Zoe offered, dropping into the room's only chair. "I want to hear the rest anyway." As Lynn turned back to the piano, she caught sight of a figure passing by the practice room window. Professor Richardson paused briefly, watching the scene inside. Lynn at the piano, surrounded by her new friends, all focused on the music before them. He gave a small nod of approval before continuing down the hallway. Lynn felt a twinge of anxiety at being observed, but pushed it aside as she began to play again. Hannah's composition filled the room, and for those moments nothing else mattered. Later, as the four of them walked to the pizza place in the crisp evening air, Raj asked the question Lynn had been dreading. "So, Lynn, are you going to perform in the winter showcase? Everyone's talking about it." Lynn sighed. "I haven't decided yet." "You should," Hannah said earnestly. Would you consider playing my piece as part of the showcase? My uncle plays cello with the Boston Symphony. I could ask him to come perform with you." Lynn stopped walking. "Your piece? You'd want me to premiere it?" Hannah nodded, her expression a mixture of hope and nervousness. "Only if you want to. No pressure. But it's your composition. Don't you want to be the one to introduce it to the world?" Hannah shook her head. "I'm a composer, not a performer. My music sounds better in your hands than it ever could in mine." Lynn felt something shift inside her. This wasn't about competition or proving herself or living up to Professor May's expectations. This was about bringing new music to life, about collaboration rather than solo glory. "I'll think about it," she said, and found that she meant it. As they continued toward the restaurant, Lynn realized that for the first time in a long time, the thought of performing didn't immediately fill her with dread. Perhaps there was a middle path. Not the high-pressure world of competitions she had fled, but not complete anonymity either. A place where she could make music with friends, where her talent could serve something beyond her own career. The autumn evening wrapped around them, and somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed 7 times. Lynn took a deep breath of the cool air, feeling strangely light, as if she had set down a heavy burden she'd been carrying for years. Nothing was decided yet, but at least now, different futures seemed possible. 2 weeks had passed since Lynn's impromptu performance in Professor Richardson's class, and autumn was deepening across the Westlake campus. Golden leaves carpeted the walkways, and the air carried the first hints of winter's approach. Lynn sat in Professor Richardson's office, her hands folded in her lap, trying to keep her breathing steady. "I appreciate your honesty," Professor Richardson said, leaning back in his chair. The late afternoon sun slanted through his office window, catching the silver in his hair. Performance anxiety is nothing to be ashamed of. Many gifted musicians struggle with it. Lynn stared at the framed concert programs on his wall, evidence of his own successful performing career. "It wasn't just ordinary nerves," she said quietly. "The last time I was scheduled to perform with the Shanghai Philharmonic, I couldn't even leave the dressing room. They had to find a replacement at the last minute." She had finally told him everything, about her rising career in China, the mounting pressure from Professor May and her parents, the panic attacks that had grown increasingly severe, and finally, her decision to leave it all behind and start fresh at Westlake. Professor Richardson nodded thoughtfully. "And you came here hoping to study music without having to perform?" "Yes, but you still love playing." It wasn't a question, but Lynn answered anyway. "I do. When it's just me or with friends like Hannah working on her composition. It feels like it used to feel. Before the competitions and the concerts and everyone's expectations." Professor Richardson was quiet for a moment, studying her face. "I have a proposal," he said finally. "Not about the winter showcase, we can set that aside for now. Something different." Lynn waited, wary but curious. "Westlake has a community outreach program. We send students to play at retirement homes, children's hospitals, community centers, places where people might not otherwise have access to live classical music." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "It's very low pressure. Small audiences, informal settings. No critics, no competitions, no grades. What are you suggesting?" "I think it might be a way for you to reconnect with performing, but on your own terms. No spotlight, no pressure to be perfect. Just sharing music with people who will appreciate it." Lynn considered this. It was different from the high-stakes performances of her past. No competition judges, no critics writing reviews, no career advancement riding on every note. "You don't have to decide right now," Professor Richardson added. "Just think about it." Lynn nodded. "I will." As she left his office, Lynn checked her phone and found a message from Hannah. "Good news. Uncle Chen said yes. He'll play the cello part for my composition. Can we practice tonight?" Lynn smiled. In the past 2 weeks, she had spent hours helping Hannah refine her composition. What had started as a favor had turned into a genuine collaboration, with Lynn offering suggestions about the piano part that Hannah eagerly incorporated. The piece had evolved into something truly special, a conversation between piano and cello that felt both intimate and universal. "I'll be there at 7, Lynn texted back. Walking across campus, Lynn spotted Thomas sitting alone on a bench, his head bent over a thick score. She hesitated, then changed direction to approach him. "Hey," she said. Thomas looked up, surprise crossing his face. "Hey, mind if I sit?" He shifted over, making room on the bench. Lynn sat, leaving space between them. "How's your Chopin coming along?" she asked. Thomas had been working on Chopin's first ballad for the past month, a piece she had overheard him practicing in the studios. "It's coming," he said with a grimace. "The coda is killing me." Lynn nodded sympathetically. "That coda is brutal. All those runs in the right hand while the left has to keep the rhythm steady." "Exactly." Thomas closed the score and turned to face her more directly. "Did you talk to Richardson?" "Just now, actually." "And?" Lynn looked out across the campus lawn, where students hurried along paths or lounged in the late afternoon sun. "I told him I'm not ready for the winter showcase." Thomas couldn't quite hide his relief. "So you're not performing at all?" "I didn't say that," Lynn replied. "I'm helping Hannah with her composition. Her uncle is coming to play the cello part." "Oh." Thomas seemed to digest this. That's great. Hannah's talented." "She is." Lynn hesitated, then added, "You know, I never wanted to take your spot in the showcase. I came to Westlake to get away from that kind of pressure." Thomas looked genuinely puzzled. "Get away? But you're amazing. You could be performing with major orchestras by now." "Maybe. But at what cost?" Lynn shook her head. "Anyway, the featured solo spot is all yours. I know you'll do the Chopin justice." A complicated expression crossed Thomas's face, relief mixed with something like disappointment. "Thanks, I think." They sat in silence for a moment, the autumn breeze rustling the few remaining leaves on the trees above them. Richardson also suggested, "I might try playing for the community outreach program." Lynn said finally, "The retirement homes and hospitals?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That's a bit below your level, isn't it?" Lynn shrugged. "Maybe that's the point. Playing music for people who just want to hear something beautiful, not judge how perfectly I execute every note." Thomas seemed to consider this. "I've never done the outreach program. Always seemed like a distraction from real practice." "Maybe we both have things to learn," Lynn said, standing up. "Anyway, I should go. I promised to meet Hannah at 7. As she walked away, Thomas called after her. "Lynn, the coda of the ballade, do you have any tips?" Lynn turned back. "Try practicing it with different rhythms. Dotted patterns, then reversed dotted patterns. Slows it down and makes your fingers more precise when you go back to the original." Thomas nodded. "Thanks, I'll try that." That evening, Lynn met Hannah in their usual practice room. They had just started working when there was a knock at the door. Hannah opened it to reveal an older man with kind eyes and a cello case strapped to his back. "Uncle Chen." Hannah threw her arms around him. "You're early." "I thought your flight wasn't until tomorrow." "I caught an earlier connection," he said, his voice warm. He looked past Hannah to Lynn. "And this must be the pianist I've heard so much about." Lynn stood, suddenly nervous. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Chen. I've heard your recordings with the Boston Symphony." Chen waved away the formality. "Please call me David, and the honor is mine. Hannah tells me you've transformed her composition." "That's not true," Lynn protested. "The piece was already beautiful. I just helped with some of the piano parts." "Let's hear it then," David said, already unlatching his cello case. "I've been practicing my part on the plane ride." For the next 2 hours, the three of them worked through Hannah's composition. David was a patient and generous collaborator, offering suggestions gently, praising the strengths of the piece. Lynn found herself relaxing in his presence, the initial awe giving way to artistic focus. When they reached the final movement, where the piano and cello lines intertwined in a complex dance, David stopped playing and simply listened as Lynn continued the piano part. "Remarkable," he said when she finished. "Your touch on those arpeggios. It's like water flowing over stones. So clear, yet so natural." Lynn felt her cheeks warm at the praise. "Thank you. Have you considered applying to the conservatory programs in Boston? With your talent—" "Uncle Chen," Hannah interrupted with a warning look. David caught himself. Forgive me. Professional habit, always scouting for talent. He smiled kindly at Lynn. But talent finds its own path, doesn't it? Lynn nodded, grateful for his understanding. As they packed up for the night, David mentioned casually, I'm playing a small recital at the Pine Ridge Retirement Community tomorrow afternoon. Just some Bach cello suites. Nothing fancy, but the residents always enjoy it. You two should come along. Lynn and Hannah exchanged looks. Actually, Lynn said slowly, Professor Richardson just told me about Westlake's community outreach program. Pine Ridge is part of that, isn't it? It is, David confirmed. I've been playing there whenever I visit Hannah. Wonderful audience. They listen with their hearts, not their critical ears. That night, Lynn lay awake in her dorm room, thinking about David's invitation and Professor Richardson's suggestion. The idea of performing again still filled her with apprehension, but this felt different somehow. Playing for people who simply wanted to experience the joy of music, without judgment or expectation, maybe that could be a way back. Her phone lit up with a text from Zoe. Heard you're working with Hannah's famous uncle. How's it going? Really well, Lynn typed back. He invited us to a retirement home concert tomorrow. The outreach program? Cool. Raj and I did that last semester. The old folks loved us. One lady gave Raj cookies after every visit. Lynn smiled in the darkness. Want to come with us tomorrow? Definitely. I'll bring my violin. We can make it a proper concert. Lynn set down her phone, feeling a sense of quiet excitement building. Not the nervous, fearful kind that had plagued her before big competitions, but something gentler and more hopeful. Tomorrow she would play again for an audience. A small step, but a step forward nonetheless. Outside her window, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, tiny white specks drifting past the glow of the campus lights. Change was in the air, not just the turning of seasons, but something shifting within her as well. For the first time in a long time, Lynn found herself looking forward to tomorrow. The Pine Ridge retirement community looked more like a small college campus than Lynn had expected, with brick buildings connected by covered walkways and gardens dusted with the previous night's light snow. A hand-painted banner hung over the entrance to the main hall. Welcome Westlake Conservatory musicians. They're really excited about this, Hannah said as they unloaded instruments from David's rental car. The activities director told me they've been talking about it all week. Lynn nodded, trying to ignore the familiar flutter of nerves in her stomach. This wasn't a concert hall. There were no critics here, no judges, no careers hanging in the balance. Just people who wanted to hear some music on a cold December afternoon. Zoe arrived moments later, violin case in hand, cheeks pink from the cold. Raj is coming too, she announced. He got held up at his music theory final but said he'll be here before we start. The four of them made their way to the community center, where a modest stage had been set up at one end of a large room. Rows of chairs filled the space, and at the back, tables with cookies and punch had been arranged for after the performance. A baby grand piano, older but well-maintained, waited on the stage. Not exactly Carnegie Hall, David said with a wink as he began to set up his music stand. It's perfect, Lynn replied, and was surprised to find she meant it. As they prepared, residents began to filter in, some walking on their own, others with canes or walkers, a few in wheelchairs pushed by staff members. They chatted among themselves as they found seats, an air of anticipation filling the room. Lynn sat at the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys to get a feel for the action. It was a good instrument, with a warm tone and responsive touch. She played a few quiet chords, letting the sound fill the space. That's lovely. Dear? Lynn looked up to see an elderly woman standing near the piano, her white hair neatly styled, a purple scarf draped around her shoulders. Thank you, Lynn said. I used to play, you know, the woman continued. Not like you young conservatory students, of course. Just for my own enjoyment. Bach was my favorite, so mathematical yet so full of feeling. I love Bach too, Lynn said. Warming to the conversation. I'm Rose, by the way. The woman extended a hand, which Lynn shook gently. Lynn, it's nice to meet you. Rose, will you be playing some Bach today? Lynn hesitated. They had planned a program of Hannah's original composition, followed by some solo pieces by David, then a few ensemble works with all of them. Bach hadn't been on the list. I could, she found herself saying. Is there a particular piece you'd like to hear? Rose's eyes lit up. The prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier. My hands can't manage those arpeggios anymore, but I still hear it in my dreams. Lynn nodded. I'd be happy to play it for you. By the time Raj arrived, slightly out of breath from rushing over, the room was full. Nearly 60 residents had gathered, along with some staff members and a few family visitors. Professor Richardson had slipped in quietly and sat in the back row, giving Lynn an encouraging nod when she spotted him. The activities director, a cheerful woman named Judy, welcomed everyone and introduced the musicians from Westlake. We're in for a special treat today, she said. These talented young people, along with our guest from the Boston Symphony, have prepared a wonderful program for us. Lynn took a deep breath as David stepped forward to introduce Hannah's composition. This was it, her first public performance since the panic attack that had ended her career in Shanghai. As David explained the piece's structure and meaning, Lynn closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself. But strangely, the paralyzing fear she had expected didn't come. Instead, she felt a quiet calm, a readiness to share this music they had worked on so lovingly. When she opened her eyes, she caught sight of Rose in the front row, leaning forward slightly in anticipation. Hannah took her place beside the piano, ready to turn pages for Lynn while David positioned his cello. A hush fell over the room. The piece began with a solo cello line, deep and resonant. David played with the assurance of decades of experience, his bow drawing a rich tone from the instrument. When Lynn's entrance came, her fingers found the keys with certainty, the piano voice answering the cello's opening statement. As they played, Lynn felt herself becoming fully absorbed in the music. The retirement home, the audience, even her own history of anxiety, all of it receded, leaving only the conversation between piano and cello, the story they were telling together through Hannah's beautifully crafted composition. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of perfect silence before the applause began, warm, appreciative, and genuine. Lynn looked out at the audience and saw faces filled with emotion. Some residents were dabbing at their eyes, others smiling broadly. Rose gave her a small, knowing nod. The program continued with David playing 2 movements from a Bach cello suite, followed by Zoe and Raj performing a lively Vivaldi duet. Throughout it all, Lynn remained at the piano, sometimes accompanying, sometimes taking center stage for a solo piece. When it came time for her to play the Bach prelude that Rose had requested, Lynn turned to face the audience. This next piece was requested by someone in our audience today, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Rose, this is for you, Bach's prelude in C major. As she played the familiar arpeggios, Lynn watched Rose close her eyes, her expression one of pure joy. The piece, with its flowing patterns and clear harmonies, had always been one of Lynn's favorites too, music that somehow managed to be both intellectually perfect and emotionally satisfying. The afternoon passed quickly, and before Lynn knew it, they had reached the end of their planned program. But as the applause died down, Thomas suddenly appeared from the back of the room, making his way to the stage with his, music folder in hand. Hope you don't mind me crashing the party, he said quietly to Lynn. Richardson told me where you were, performing. Lynn moved over on the piano bench, making room for him. Not at all. What are you playing? Well, Thomas said with a small smile. I thought maybe we could try something together. Do you know Schubert's Fantasia in F minor for piano 4 hands? Lynn nodded, surprised. The Schubert was a piece for 2 pianists sharing 1 piano, a true collaboration requiring perfect coordination and communication between players. I have the score here, Thomas continued. Unless you'd rather not? No, I'd like that, Lynn said. And she meant it. They announced the unexpected addition to the program, and as they positioned themselves side by side at the piano, Lynn felt a new kind of nervousness, not the debilitating fear of her past performances, but the healthy excitement of creating music with someone else, of diving into the unknown together. The Schubert began with Thomas playing the hauntingly beautiful main theme, Lynn joining with harmonizing chords. As the piece progressed, their parts intertwined, sometimes crossing over each other, their hands sharing the keyboard in a delicate dance. Lynn found herself smiling as they navigated a particularly tricky passage, feeling Thomas adjust his timing to match hers. When they reached the triumphant final section, their playing completely synchronized, Lynn realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her. Music had once again become a source of joy rather than anxiety, of connection rather than isolation. As the final chords of the Schubert faded away, the room erupted in enthusiastic applause. Lynn and Thomas stood together, bowing to their appreciative audience. Across the room, Professor Richardson was beaming, and beside him Lynn was startled to see a familiar face, Professor May, her former teacher from Shanghai, watching with tears in her eyes. Later, as residents came up to thank them and share stories of their own musical experiences, Rose approached Lynn again. "That was exactly how I remember it," she said, referring to the Bach. "You play from the heart, not just the fingers. Don't ever lose that." Lynn thanked her, then made her way through the crowd to where Professor May waited. "Professor," Lynn said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I didn't know you were in the country." "Professor Richardson contacted me," May explained, her usual strict demeanor softened by evident emotion. "He thought I might want to see how my star pupil was doing." Lynn braced herself for criticism, for disappointment, for pressure to return to the competitive circuit. Instead, Professor May took her hands gently. "I owe you an apology, Lynn. I pushed you too hard, expected too much. In my determination to develop your extraordinary talent, I forgot about nurturing your love for music itself." She glanced around at the retirement home residents, still buzzing with excitement from the performance. This is also important, perhaps more important than the grand concert halls." Lynn felt tears welling in her eyes, tears of release after years of carrying the weight of expectations and fear. "I'm not ready to go back to competitions," she said. "I know," Professor May replied. "And that's okay. Music finds its own path, its own purpose." She smiled, a rare sight. "You played beautifully today, Lynn, not perfect, but honest. That matters more than I understood before." As they joined the others for refreshments, Lynn felt a sense of coming full circle. 2 months ago, Professor Richardson had ordered her to play a difficult piece, expecting her to fail. That moment had set in motion a journey she could never have anticipated, not back to the high-pressure world she had fled, but to a new understanding of why she had fallen in love with music in the first place, surrounded by her new friends, by mentors old and new, by an audience who had listened with their hearts. Lynn realized she had found what she had been searching for all along, not anonymity but authenticity. Not escape from music, but a new way to embrace it, on her own terms, sharing its beauty with others who truly needed it. Outside the windows, snow began to fall again, soft flakes dancing in the winter light. A new season was beginning for the world and for Lynn.